Thank you so much for coming to this fantastic event tonight. I'm so excited to see so many people. We've had some questionable weather, but we got a break here so that everyone could be here. I'm so excited to have this presentation about Buxton. It's been one of the topics in my classrooms in history that has been very exciting to people. By the way, I'm Brooke Sherrard, and I teach history here at William Penn. And we have a person to introduce our guest tonight, and is a senior history major here at William Penn, Blake Van Houweling, who has been the president of Phi Alpha Theta National History Honor Society for 2 years. So, Blake.
Thank you, and welcome. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "You can kill a dreamer, but you cannot kill the dream." Buxton may be gone, but it lives on through the lessons it has to teach us. And tonight, we are very fortunate to have Rachelle Chase to help us teach that lesson. Rachelle.
Can you hear me? Oh, there. Ooh, now you can hear me. Well, thanks everybody for coming. When Dana was setting up the chairs, I said, oh no, we won't need that many. You can put some of those away, but it looks like we needed them, so thanks for coming. As Blake said, my name is Rachelle Chase. I'm going to be talking about Buxton, and in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about the town, but I'm also going to talk about the creating and the making of the town as well. Okay, a little bit about me, not much. I just wanted to really point out here that a couple of things, that I am a published author. I wrote romance first, had about 9 novels come out, then switched when I discovered Buxton in 2008, I should say the site itself. I just couldn't get it out of my mind. I mean, my friend took me to the site. I couldn't believe this existed in the middle of, farmland. And so each time I would visit her, I would just research more and more and had no idea what I was going to do with it. And so when I moved here in 2014, which that was one of the reasons why I moved here, was really to write this book, because I knew I couldn't do it from California. I said, I've got to write it. So Lost Buxton, the first book, which was more of a pictorial history, was born. And then just a few weeks ago, January 28th, Creating the Back Utopia of Buxton, Iowa was released. So that's really how I got into this. I like to also give that background to let everybody know that I am not a historian. I am simply someone who fell in love with Buxton, researched it for a number of years, and decided I had to write a book about it. So I like to start usually with just some statistics. A show of hands, just curious, who's heard of Buxton? All right, that's pretty much everybody. And how many of you have read books about Buxton? You're pretty familiar with it. Okay, good show of hands too. Well, just a few statistics, just so we're all working on the same foundation here. Buxton was actually established by the Consolidation Coal Company in 1900 after the mines in Muchakinock, Muchakinock, Muchy, I'll just say, had played out. And you can see in this map where the starburst is, that's where Buxton was. It straddled both Mahaska and Monroe counties. It was about 8,600 acres in Monroe County and another 1,600 acres in Mahaska County. The company paid about $275,000 at that time for the land, although they put in about $6 million into the town, the mining rights, equipment, etc. So it was quite the operation. From about 1900 to 1910, it was the largest unincorporated town in Iowa. Some people have said it was the largest unincorporated town in the United States at that time. There's approximately 1,000 homes, although not everybody lived in company housing in Buxton, and it's not certain where all of those houses were occupied, but there was never a shortage of housing in Buxton. There were about 5,000 residents in its heyday, which was by about 1905 is when the population was about 5,000. And it remained pretty much consistent throughout till about 1914 or so. About 1922 was when Buxton was pretty much over and the company had moved operations out to Consul, Haydock, and Bucknell. So it wasn't around that much, or that long, I should say. But of course, the thing that most people talk about the most is the fact that it was integrated. There was no segregation in Buxton, and for a large percentage of its existence, African Americans were the largest ethnic group in the town. So they made up about 55% for the first 10 years or so. So that's kind of more, like I said, of just kind of the statistics, and that's interesting, but it doesn't really talk about, how so many African Americans ended up in Buxton, and, why it was so different from the other coal mining towns, of its time around in the area. So first of all, it started with the McNeills, H.W. Hobart McNeill and Wilbur A. McNeill. And they had started in around the 1870s, they'd started buying up coal mines in the area. They started with Iowa Central Coal and then had purchased about three or four others. And by about 1874, they merged it all into the Consolidation Coal Company. So it started off well. They were doing well. They had about three mines or so going, several hundred men, until around 1879, which is when they started having problems in that the miners there in Muchy were striking. They wanted more pay. And at that time, the McNeills actually had said, they were kind of in a bind because they had contracts out with the railroad. They had orders to fill for coal. And so they agreed. The miners came back and asked for more. H.W. had said, that's it. He said, I'm through. He discharged the gruntled miners and decided that he was going to get recruit African Americans to work in the mines. Now, the McNeills were not the first to do that. There were other coal mines in the area that actually had hired African Americans. Albia Coal was one. White Breast Coal had hired people from Missouri. But the McNeills probably saw that and thought, you know what, we want to try this. So they actually sent recruiters to Virginia. And I was really pleased to find this ad. I had found this in one of the Virginia papers where, it says OFF FOR Iowa, and this was in the Valley Virginian. And it's advertising black men to come work in the coal mines in Iowa. And so if you look here at the bottom, you'll see that H.W. McNeill is listed there as well. And there's another man there listed, a Major Thomas Shoemate. I don't know about Taylor Jefferson. I haven't researched him yet. But Major Thomas Shoemate was actually an ex-Confederate soldier. So I'm trying to research to figure out how that connection came about. I'm not really sure how that happened, but about the time that McNeill went was the time that Shoemate was involved in some of the recruiting. Hope Armstrong, which was a prominent African American that had close ties with the McNeills and the company, also was there, at least for the early efforts. So they would place bills, in various locations, have the men contact, come to the hotel, Virginia Hotel, and they would, in a sense, be interviewed. And if they, it worked out for both of them, they would then catch a train and go to Muchy in the following day. So there were several trips like this, several recruiting efforts that were done. This picture here is a picture of the Muchy yard. And so this is around 1879, 1880 when they're doing this recruiting, and all's going pretty well, pretty good in the area. There's, like I said, several hundred residents. There's a few mines, 3 mines in operation. There's some businesses. But right about this time, maybe it was because of all the strikes, the McNeills are now ready to sell. They've decided that they have had enough of this. There was a buyer nearby. Now, it's unclear who approached who in terms of did the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad go to the McNeills and make an offer, or did the McNeills reach out to them? Uncertain, but there was a pre-existing relationship between the two before the sale happened. So anyway, the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad was expanding throughout Iowa. Like most of the railroads in the 1880s, it was an expansion period. And so they were looking for what you call a captive mine, which was really a mine that they would own, that the coal would be supplied, it would just supply just them. So because they were buying also coal from other mines as well. So that's why that was their interest in consolidation coal. So the McNeills sold for $500,000, and interestingly enough, it appeared that Hobart regretted that sale later on, and a reporter had interviewed him, and he said that he thought he sold it for too cheap. He tried to buy a percentage back, and the railroad, of course, said no. So the McNeills then went on to do other things, which I think I cover a little bit later. So right after the McNeills are sold out and consolidation took over, Marvin Hewitt, who was the president of the railroad and the president of consolidation, had asked, do you have any recommendations for who would be a good person to take over running the company? And McNeills said John Emery Buxton, who actually was he was new to being a superintendent, but he was not new to the railroad industry. He had come from Vermont, from a wealthy family, had given up farming and came to Boone County and was working as a buyer for the railroad then. Not to Chicago Northwestern, but another one. Anyway, so he takes over and decides, to accept being the superintendent. So guess what, of course, they decide to do the minute they take over. They decide, okay, we're going to change the way the miners are paid again. And that did not go over well, so there's another strike that happens. There's more recruitment efforts going on in Virginia. And again, we've got the African-American population growing. So here is a picture of Muchakinock. It's the downtown area, the main street. And this is about 1887. You have about, the population has now grown to about 1,600 to 1,800 people. You have 70% or so of those African Americans. You're up to 4 mines, and now Muchy is considered the largest unincorporated town in Iowa. By about 1895, the number of residents had gone up to 3,844, and there's numerous businesses in town, and the population is about 60% or so African American. So again, this is pretty much just kind of showing that this is how you ended up getting so many African Americans, because then when Buxton was established, they moved over to Buxton. So Ben Buxton ended up being the superintendent of when Buxton was started. He actually took over in 1897 when his father decided he didn't want to die with the harness on, in his words. And Ben actually had graduated from Northwestern University, but interestingly enough, he actually did go to school here as well. He was enrolled in, at that point, there was just like the scientific path, that's all it said. That's all I've been able to find out in terms of what his studies were here. But he did attend here first the prep, Penn Academy, which was a prep for this, and then attended school here for a couple years before he then got typhoid fever and then ended up going to Northwestern. So he actually, like I said, was a superintendent, very much involved in the planning of the town. So as I mentioned, people moved over from Muchy, so that's how you got the large African-American population there. It ended up being a bigger and better Muchy, as you will see in a minute here. And it was even better for African-Americans than Muchy had been. And it was better for everyone. The town, as I mentioned, was different than other coal mining towns in Iowa at that time. And we believe it might be because of welfare capitalism. Dorothy Schweiter and Elmer Schweiter, Joseph Araba, in their book, Buxton, Iowa, A Black Utopia in the Heartland, had introduced this idea that it could have been welfare capitalism. Well, when I was researching and did some research on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, I discovered that that was very much a part of their culture, and that was going on at the time. And what this was for the first time, companies were starting to look at doing more for employees than just giving them a paycheck. They were doing, providing housing, providing some of these other additional benefits to try to create this loyal workforce, and a workforce that wouldn't strike. So this was going on very much in the Chicago Northwestern Railroad in their culture at this time, which most likely may have influenced Buxton as well, because the Buxtons would have known that, being affiliated with the railroad. They would have also heard of Pullman, Illinois, which was the biggest welfare capitalism town at that time. It had a model city, I should say. So it is believed that that did influence them. So let's look at the town here. This is just a picture of a residential part of town. The big white building in the back was the high school that was only in existence for a few years. About 1906 it burnt down and they didn't rebuild it. But this is a residential area, and as you can see, the houses are arranged pretty orderly. They're in rows. They are on a pretty good, decent size of land, and this was intentional. Ben Buxton actually hired architects and engineers to help lay out the town, which would have been very different from other coal mining towns at that time when people lived in little more than shacks. Housing for other coal mining towns was pretty much considered temporary because they knew the mines would play out and they would move the people. But in Buxton, they pretty much spent money on the towns, on the houses, and they also, as I mentioned before, were integrated. So housing was awarded on a first-come, first-served basis, so you would have had African Americans and white people living next door to each other in the order that, their names came up. This is just another area of the town as well, another residential area, and you can see the backyards a little bit more there where they were pretty good sized. And I wanted to play a little bit of I have some audio here from some residents that were interviewed as part of the Dorothy Schweeder project. And so I wanted to just play something from Carl Kitzman to give you a little bit of information about the housing. So in case you can't hear the audio, I have the words here as well, I think. There we go.
When they first killed him, they painted him with the dark red tar. The company took good care of the property. There was 4 houses per acre, quarter acre each. And they, story and a half, 5-room house rented for $7 per month. 2 bedrooms upstairs, and you had a kitchen and a dining room. Well, some had a bedroom downstairs. And then they had a 6-room house. That was the kitchen built on. Those rented for $8 a month.
And then this is a picture of the town itself, what you would consider the downtown area. The white building here in the back, the 2-story one, that was the company store right here. This other white building over there in the back was the YMCA, and then the little building right there in front was the Boys Y. So again, this was different from other coal mining towns as well, but very common for welfare capitalism to have a store or to have a Y as well. But in Buxton, this provided a lot of entertainment for the people. The YMCA had classes there at night for the men. You had automotive classes. There were reading classes. It was a lot of sports. They had basketball there. There were also parks throughout town as well. People also said they had a bocce ball. They had tennis courts. They had golf. And so anything to keep men occupied so that they weren't drinking and gambling was definitely beneficial. So they wanted to have a lot of recreational outlets for the men. And as I mentioned before, it was integrated also in town as well. So you would have company store clerks. 18 of the 85 or so company store clerks were African American. The YMCA, which they spent $20,000 to build, that was also built for African American men, although both did use it, and it was run by them as well, which again, that would have been very different. So let me just play another recording regarding what one of the gentlemen had to say about the Y, or not the Y, the downtown area.
We had a park, and we used to have picnics down there and band concert, and Mr. Buxton and his family would come down and they'd set a table and feed them. They'd come down and eat a meal with the people. And we'd have stands and sell different things, ice cream, and all of them have a stand, and we'd sell stuff with our stands. And we had a merry-go-round. That was our biggest entertainment.
And so I mentioned the company store earlier. This was the company store in Muchy, and you can tell by this photo there are quite a number of African Americans there, as I mentioned. But this store would have been more of your typical coal mining store, in that it had just the basic goods that you would need, and also the supplies that the men would need, because they had to pay for their own mining equipment as well. This next picture, though, is a picture of the first Buxton company store, the W.A. Wells company store. And this was a 2-story structure that had various departments. You could buy anything there. They had a buyer who was out of Chicago and would order goods from New York and St. Louis and Chicago as well. And they also had a window designer who would design displays in the window. And they would also recruit people or they would advertise in the paper for people outside of Buxton to come in and go shopping. So again, there was a lot of opportunities or a lot of things that people could buy here. It was 2 stories, and they also had an elevator that would go up and down on the different floors. This particular store burned down in 1911, and then they built this one. And this picture is actually a picture of the grand opening of the store. And you see that, you can barely see it, there was a Buxton Savings Bank over there on the right-hand side where that awning is. The building that they're constructing right now, or in this picture I should say, was the White House Hotel. And if you go out to the Buxton site today, there's just barely remnants of this. There's a little bit of foundation of the White House Hotel and of the store itself. So let's listen to what Mr. Kitzman had to say about the store. Oops, maybe not. There we go.
You could buy anything in that company store, from a diaper pin to a car. The company had their own morticians, their own mortuaries. They had a shoe department, shoe repair department, furniture, hardware, groceries, cookingware, clothing, and yard goods. The company store had a bank in it, company office, a soda fountain where they served lunches. Of course, at that time, there was no electrical appliances.
Now, there was some electricity in town. The store, of course, would have been had electricity. There were a couple of stops, like lamp posts there that you can barely see. There was electricity on the street right in front. The doctor's offices had some, and the superintendents had some, and the YMCA. But as he mentioned, the people did not. The other thing is you could order things. Anything you could get in the Sears and Roebuck catalog, you could have shipped to the store, and they would take it to your house. So again, this was very different from other mining towns, but it was something that was provided in welfare capitalist towns. This is the YMCA I mentioned before, that I said that the company spent about $20,000 building for African Americans' use and management. The first level that you see there would have been where the men paid their dues. They paid about $1 a month to belong. And it also had a mahogany pianola. It had reading rooms and libraries and, chairs for people to sit in and throw rugs. And I think I mentioned the pianola. It also had a gymnasium on that floor. It had some weights for the men. There were also pool tables. And it had washrooms there as well. And then the second level would have been your auditorium. So they had traveling shows that would come to town. They also had 2 French women in town that would show movies during the week. And so everybody would come to the movie theater, all races. There was no segregated seating, so you could sit wherever you wanted. And then the top level was more for like union meetings, which that was also very different from Buxton as well, in that Buxton was unionized. And when Ben took over, there was a threat of a strike when Buxton started, but he had encouraged the men to join the union, which was also very rare for that time, for a company owner to do that. So anyway, the top level would have been for some of the union meetings. It would have been for your lodge functions and more of those kind of administrative things. And then the little building that you see over there was the Boys' Y. The first level had a swimming pool, which they said was heated. And then the second level was a roller skating rink, and also some of the adults would have dances there. So again, lots of things to do for the people. And again, the company wanted that. So let's listen to what this resident had to say about the Y.
Yeah, when I was in Buxton here, I belonged to the YMCA. But mostly I like to read, and we had all kind of books in there. They had history books there. Well, they all got all kinds of magazines and things like that, and newspapers. Chicago paper, the Des Moines paper, and then they had papers there from, I believe, from Pennsylvania, and then New York papers there too.
Okay, I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here. So they also had churches in Buxton. At one time, there were at least 8 African American churches. This shows the ones that are most well known and that we have photos of. There's 2 white churches and 2 black churches. So the Ebenezer Lutheran Church was the Swedish church in the middle, and then the Slovak church there on the bottom, then the Mount Zion Church over there on the far left, and the St. John's AME churches. Those 2 were black churches. The churches were segregated, but that was by choice. Again, people said that there was not forced segregation, but people felt more comfortable going to their own churches. There was also, I forgot to mention that in most of the other mining towns, if there was a church, there'd probably be 1 church and attendance would be mandatory. In Buxton, again, didn't care how many churches. The churches were actually a great source of once again, keeping the gambling under control. The women were very active in the church, and they actually had formed certain groups where that was their charter and their mission was to close down, the gambling that was going on in the surrounding areas. So again, the company liked churches. So that's a little bit about the town and how the town was different. But the integration and equality piece of Buxton, which is very different, was definitely not a component of welfare capitalism. That was not something that you found in most other companies. In mentioning Buxton was integrated, I mentioned that people were neighbors because housing was awarded on a first-come, first-served basis. The men also would have worked together in the rooms, in the mines, not necessarily in the same room, but in neighboring rooms. The clerks I mentioned in the store worked side by side, serving both black and white customers. The children were in the same classrooms, taught by both black and white teachers. There were 3 schools in Buxton, not counting the high school that burnt down, and they had about 12 teachers in each school. The people attended events together, most of the public events like the baseball games, the picnics, the parades, the movies, those kind of things. But in terms of socializing on their own time, it really depended on who you asked. Some residents said, "Yep, I did." Others said, "No, we pretty much on our own time, we didn't really mix." So it really depended on who you asked. Dorothy Collier was one of the ones who said it was an integrated social experience. So let's see what she has to say about her experiences there. Maybe, there we go.
When I think back, it's such a life, You think how good everybody was, the white and the colored, Mama had both friends. Ladies would come over and visit, and in the winter, the women would put a quilt in a frame, and then the neighbor friends would come in, they'd quilt that quilt. And
this would be both white women and black
women?
Yes,
And then Charles Linger had an opinion about the schools being integrated.
Instruction, I thought, was very good. I had a black school teacher. I think her name was Mrs. Blackburn, and she was an excellent teacher that I recall.
And then this was just some comments from other people. Archie Harris was a miner there. He said that the men gambled together. Lucy Hart mentioned that the kids used to swim together. They used to play after school together. Sister Maureen Safranco said a black doctor had attended her mother when her brother was born. Another resident had said a black dentist was there as well, serving both black and white patients. And then Joe Rabarchak said that his brother used to go to the dances in town. So again, it really depended on who you asked in terms of what the integration was beyond work. So as I mentioned before, not only were African Americans there, it was a thriving African American community. There was lots of leadership in the town. There were African American hotel owners. They owned restaurants, grocery stores, drugstores, a bakery, pool halls, dance hall, a music store. There were several doctors in town that were black. There were several black lawyers. There was a dentist, at least one, several pharmacists, constables, teachers, property owners, and the list goes on and on. More meat markets, newspapers. Again, it just goes on. And I think, I don't know if I have it on this one, but one of the pharmacists, there was a woman pharmacist there who was one of the first African American women to get a pharmacy degree here in Iowa. So again, you had not just blacks living there, but they were thriving. Oops. Hope Armstrong, I mentioned before. These were just some of the names that came up. People that were interviewed mentioned them. Hope Armstrong was a prominent African American there. As I mentioned before, he was one of the recruiters that did some of the recruiting in Virginia. He also was a mule buyer, would buy mules for the company, for the mines. He also owned the meat market there. He was also in Muchy, so he came over to Buxton where he continued his meat market business, had a slaughterhouse, had a meat wagon that would go around to the different neighborhoods taking orders. He raised thoroughbred racehorses. He had, at least when he was in Muchy, he had about 96 racehorses that he would actually race throughout Iowa and was really pretty well known for that. He was also one of the largest landowners in southern Iowa, owning about 1,600 or more acres. He also had 16 to 18 houses that he would rent out to people of both races. Lottie Armstrong was his daughter. Here's what Linger has to say about her.
Lottie Armstrong. She was in the banking. She ran the bank. I remember us being a manager at the bank.
And then not only was she a manager at the bank, she was also a stockholder in the bank, and she also was a vice president, I found in an article. So again, this would have been rare for a woman at that time, not alone, in addition to an African-American woman. Dr. E.A. Carter was another name that came up. His parents were enslaved. He was the first African-American to graduate from the University of Iowa College of Medicine and get a medical degree. He graduated one of the best in his class. And when he graduated, he returned or went to Buxton, and actually the company hired him as a company doctor there, which is, he would have probably been one of the ones that was that Sister Maureen Safranco was talking about, because he did treat both black and white patients. And interestingly enough, he also had a white man that worked for him. So again, this would have been very rare, if unheard of, other places. George Woodson was one of the attorneys there in Buxton. His parents had been enslaved. He was a lawyer, very well renowned throughout Iowa, known for winning cases. He was a great orator. He was also the founder of the Iowa Negro Bar Association, the National Bar Association. He was also a co-founder of the Niagara Movement, which was a precursor to the NAACP. He was very active in the Republican Party. He had been, I think it was in 1898, he was the nominee for the file clerk for the Senate, and he lost by one vote to a white man by the name of Charles McClure. Again, this would have been very rare for that time. So he was a very well-known speaker as well, traveling throughout Iowa, talking about the importance for black people to education and wealth. Reuben Gaines Sr. was another prominent African-American there, owned a lot of property, 80 acres in what was considered Gainestown. He built the Buxton Hotel for about $10,000. It had steam heat, and it was a two-story concrete structure. He also was very much involved in the gambling side of affairs there. He owned quite a few saloons. He owned quite a few businesses that he would then lease out, or buildings that he would then lease out to other businesses. He actually sold the pharmacy to B.F. Cooper, and B.F. Cooper was a well-renowned pharmacist there in town, had one of the biggest pharmacies. He owned a drugstore and a club. And what was kind of interesting is I find that a lot of the drugstore owners, they were one of the few that were allowed to sell alcohol. So they oftentimes would have a club upstairs above the drugstore, where you could obviously get the alcohol that was not medicinal. So it was just interesting that it seemed like that was kind of a pattern that was going on there. He established and managed the Buxton Wonders, which was the well-renowned baseball team out of Buxton. And I forgot to mention that these were also men that came over from Muchy, that had started their businesses in Muchy. And B.F. Cooper actually started the baseball team there, brought some of those members over to Buxton as well. So just a few other names that came up. Minnie B. London was a teacher who became a principal there in Buxton. Louis Reesby started off with a lunch cart. Actually, he used to sell goods out of a basket to people that were gambling in the wooded areas. Made enough money doing that to buy a lunch cart for about $500. And his wife and children and daughters used to cook chicken every weekend, and they would go through like 250 chickens in a weekend. So he made enough money to buy real estate and became very successful in the real estate business. There's a couple of other names. Hattie Hutchison, that's the one I mentioned before. That was the first African-American woman to get a pharmacy degree in Iowa. Dr. Charles Taylor was another doctor there in town that had a private practice. And then Margaret M. Coleman was an author who appears in the Iowa State Bystander on occasion, different articles she wrote, but I haven't been able to find her book yet. She supposedly wrote a book as well. Buxton Wonders, I mentioned before. This was the people that are identified here. This was actually taken from Gordon Peterson and BuxtonIowa.com. If you're interested in the suite experience, that's a great website, which I'll mention again at the end. That's a good place to go. But this was a picture of the Buxton Wonders. And in the beginning, that was an all-black team. But this picture is probably around 1912, 1914 when the team was integrated. So the Buxton Wonders were very well renowned throughout Iowa. It was, a lot of people have said they could have played pro ball had it been a different time. And they were actually minors who just played ball in their spare time because for the love of the game. And according to residents, and also the Buxton Wonders had a great reputation. Some of it, I'm not sure it's totally true, but, he says Zebo Lewis, who was one of the good players there, got more home runs than Babe Ruth. They never lost a game, no sir. It's like, well, they did lose a few games. But these other are true. They could have played pro, and they did play some of the Negro League teams, like the Kansas City Monarchs, the New York Black Yanks, the Chicago Union Giants, the Minneapolis Gophers. They played various teams. They did face discrimination. Again, as I mentioned, or the person said they could have been pro. George Neal is an example of one of them that could have been pro. He was actually a tailor in town, but he played third baseman in his spare time. And he also became the manager of the Buxton Wonders. That's a picture of him. He's the one on the far left, and I don't know who the other gentleman is in his tailor shop. And here is also, I just want to share this. This was an article Mary Jane Graves Collier, who was Dorothy Collier's. This was this would have been her grandfather. Somebody gave her this article, and it was this letter from a scout who says, if you can't see that, it says the part there, traveling through the country and being quite a baseball fan, I have found one of the best third basemen in the country, if not the best. He is a black man, and therefore I cannot use him, so I will recommend this player to the colored magnates. So again, and it goes on to talk about him. Again, this is an example of showing that, yes, he could have played had the times been different, but this is a person who was a scout going around looking for players said, I can't use him because he's black. So this is, let's listen to what this person has to say about George Neal's ability to play. And I don't think I have words for this one. Let's see, maybe you won't be able to listen. Oh. Well, I don't know what's going on there, but the audio was saying that the Buxton Wonders were kind of like the Harlem Globetrotters of their time, in that they would clown. George Neal would do somersaults on the field. Some of them, would do cartwheels. Oh no, he would do cartwheels. Some of them would do like somersaults to the bases. So they were really showmen, and they made the game fun. And a lot of the people said it was because they were that good. When they played serious teams, and they got serious. But if it was an easy win for them, they put on a show for the people. The Buxton Coronet Band was another group, I guess, in town that was also very well renowned. They would travel around playing in different towns, giving different performances. The three women that are there, according to Frank Heath, who had studied the bands and such in Iowa, there were no women players here, so those were probably just friends or somebody in the photo. But again, they had instruments. The company supplied them with with uniforms on occasion, and the company did also pay for the manager, the person who managed the band. So again, this was not the norm. All of these things I'm mentioning were not necessarily the norm in all of the coal mining towns where you would have a baseball team or a well-renowned band. Around 1914, I think I mentioned, that's when things kind of Buxton started having problems in that the demand for coal had started declining. There were layoffs in Buxton for the first time. I think I mentioned before that since the Consolidation Coal Company supplied coal only to the railroad, the business was pretty much year-round. And so that's why money flowed in Buxton, because the men were always working. Well, this started to change in about 1914 when they started experiencing layoffs. By about 1918, the mines in and around Buxton had pretty much played out, and so they were starting to move operations to Bucknell, Haydock, Console. By 1919, there were about 400 residents. By 1922, there was absolutely nobody in Buxton. In about 1925, Consolidation sold the company to Superior Coal, which was interesting because the railroad owned Superior Coal as well. And so they really were trying to get out of Iowa. Superior Coal was in Illinois. So they were trying to transfer the business to their Illinois branch so that they could eliminate having to pay some taxes. So by about 1927, there were some more striking issues. The demand had gone down, and so Superior pretty much said, that's it, we're getting out of this totally. So everything was gone by 1927. So I just want to go back to, and I'm almost done here, probably another 5 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions. I just want to go back to this concept of utopia in that, was Buxton, really, was it really a utopia? Because that's been bandied about a bit. And, of course not. It wasn't perfect. There were signs of racism in some of the interviews. Some of the white people interviewed, or at least one had said that he did not feel, comfortable going to the YMCA. He didn't feel like he was welcome there. Another one said that, another one of the black men that was interviewed said that his grandparents, they had pretty much tried to convince them not to trust white people. So he said that they raised them that way, although he said he wasn't buying into it. Some of the white people that were interviewed, they used the N-word when referring to black people, or stated that, some of the blacks that were successful there that were lighter color, they were successful because they weren't full blacks. So you did have, of course, people coming to this town with whatever their perception was of the other race. But again, when you think about what people were coming, especially black people were coming there from, it's like this would have felt like, this is nothing compared to where we've been. And everybody interviewed pretty much said that regardless of these things, there was never any violence in Buxton that was racially motivated. The other thing that Buxton had a reputation of being was being a rough town, that, that there was lots of, fighting and murders, and if you look at the headlines in some of the other newspapers, it always had some sensationalized headline about Buxton. And this pretty much bothered the people that lived there. They felt that it wasn't deserved. They felt like, it's no different than any other town its size. And Dorothy Schweeder and her team had done some research as well and pretty much came to that same conclusion. But this is what Mr. Kitzman had to say about that reputation. Oops. I don't know why the audio's not playing. All right, does anybody want to read it? This is like school, when the teacher used to say, okay, somebody want to read this? No volunteers? You're going to make me read it? Okay, please.
It always burnt me up. The town had such a hard name. Didn't deserve it. It didn't deserve it. I was over in Illinois. My wife and I went over there. We met a lady, and she asked us where we had been from, where we was from, and we was from Iowa, and from that part. Around Albia. She wanted to know where we lived, and we said, close to Buxton. That's the town you go through with a gun in your hand, in each hand, and a knife in your teeth. Now, where in the hell did you get that idea?
Right. Thank you. Appreciate that. And so, yeah, this was what his impression was, and he was pretty upset that they had that reputation. So again, was it really a utopia? As I said before, yes, for the African American residents that were interviewed, they pretty much felt that it was, considering where they were coming from. A lot of the white residents that were interviewed pretty much felt like, well, it was just another town for them. That was a good town, but it wasn't necessarily any better or worse than anywhere else they'd been. And I think to consider why there was this difference for the African Americans was to really think about what was going on at that time. And you know, the 13th Amendment had been passed a mere 35 years before Buxton was established. And so for many of the people that had come there from the South, you know, slavery was very recent in their minds. And so this is actually what one of the residents had to say about that. I hope this plays. I don't know why we're not getting audio all of a sudden. Well, I guess we're not going to get it. Any other volunteers? No? My goodness. Okay, this Charles Taylor said, they were told that, you know, the kids were taught what slavery was like. My grandmother saw her mother, 5 of her brothers and sisters auctioned off. So again, these were people that were coming to this that had that experience very fresh. It wasn't like something that they had read about in a book. And one of the other residents also said that that was part of their family dinner time, is their grandmother would share stories of what it was like, you know, in those times. So this was very real. Also, Jim Crow was very rampant at that time. It would have been also obviously the enforced segregation, but then there were all of the what Dr. David Pilgrim says. He's written a few books about Jim Crow. It was the social etiquette as well, and the customs. So you had every aspect of life being regulated, you know, by rules. You know, you couldn't introduce yourself to a white person. You couldn't shake hands. You couldn't, you know, correct them. You couldn't laugh. You couldn't look in the eye. You had to get off the sidewalk. You had to give the right of way in the street. I mean, it was like all of these rules that you had to follow, and any perceived, you know, infraction could be, you know, cause for beatings, lynchings, what have you. So again, coming from this to Buxton would have felt like utopia. And it wasn't just going on in other places in the South. It was also going on, you know, in Iowa at that time, outside of Buxton. So here's what one resident has to say about that. Maybe not. I'll just have to read what one resident had to say about that. He says, wanted to go to Oskaloosa or someplace like that. They didn't dare show their face in the window of the train or get on the platform. There was a bunch there throwing rocks or shooting at them or anything. They weren't allowed in Beacon at all. It was a white town, and they didn't want no blacks in there. One time, me and another black fella went to Oskaloosa to a circus, and we was wandering around the town and went into a pool hall, and was gonna have a game of pool, and we started playing a part of a game, and they come and stopped us. No colored in there, and we had to vacate. Ottumwa, it was just like Oskaloosa. Sorry, he wasn't picking on Oskaloosa. He just happened to mention it there. But again, it was just to say that this was going on in towns throughout Iowa, and not just, you know, outside of the state. The last item really was the Klan. The Klan was very active in Buxton, or I should say not in Buxton, sorry, in the U.S. It's estimated that there was between 2 to 4 million members, Klan members nationwide around the time Buxton was in existence, in the later part of Buxton's years, I should say. This is actually a picture in 1924 of a funeral procession in Ottumwa. But again, it was also going on in the farming communities literally surrounding Buxton. So it wasn't, again, it was very different. All right, so I have to read again. Oh yeah, I remember them well. This is Clifford Lewis talking here. Well, not literally, but this is his quote. Oh yeah, I remember them well. I never belonged to any of them, but they were thick around here. They had meetings and burned a cross right up the road here, 3/4 of a mile, and they had farmers all around, and they had their meetings every so often on several of the farms. Not everybody belonged to them, just, maybe a third of the people belonged. I never belonged. I wasn't sympathizing with them. And the interviewer says, none of your family were ever involved in the Klan? My dad was, and I had an uncle that was. I had a great uncle, and one of them belonged, but that's the only ones in our family. So it's like what I found interesting here was the fact that he says those are the only ones, and he's almost named, a big percentage of his family, and it's like, oh, not many, just maybe a third, and I'm thinking a third, So my point is, it's just kind of showing that this was kind of the norm. It wasn't unique. So the $1 million question after all this, it was, why did consolidation do this? Why did they create this town that was, integrated where blacks and whites were treated equal? Why? Well, unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that question because it still remains the $1 million question that everybody wants to know. But still searching for that. I have a few guesses, I guess. But I want to leave you with this, and then we'll open it up for questions. Just this. Well, it was going to be an audio clip on what she had to say about Buxton, Susie Robinson. This is a picture of Buxton Today. Unfortunately, that's the biggest ruin that's remaining. That's the stone warehouse where the company would store their excess goods. Susie Robinson says there's no place that's ever going to be like Buxton. That's the best place that I've ever been, Buxton. And that's where everybody lived happy, was Buxton. So that is it. Just for more information, I have some information up here. I've already told you about my books, but there's also a few books by Leanne Simmers Dickey. If you're doing any research about Buxton, she's written Buxton Branches and Buxton Roots, where she's gone through marriage records, death records, and compiled all of this in her books. If you want to visit Buxton, the Monroe County Historical Society and Museum in Albia is a good place to start since it's on private land. The Peterson family I mentioned, the Swedish experience, Gordon Peterson at BuxtonIowa.com has done research there. The African American Museum of Iowa in Cedar Rapids and the State Historical Society of Iowa have a bunch of information and images. Of course, the Iowa Public Television documentary Searching for Buxton, of which the university here was partly responsible for, is also a good source. And then there's some other books. Dorothy Schweiter's book I mentioned, David Gradwell's book I mentioned, Outside In also has some information. There's a Remembering Buxton Club that's starting up now at the Forest Avenue Library. And then I've started a website called lostbuxton.com where I'm just putting information that I find. So I am really done, I promise this time, so I will stop talking and open it up for questions. Thanks. Any questions? Yes. What are your hunches for why? Well, I think the question was why. What are my guesses for why the company, why the town was so different? I really think part of it has to do with the people that started it, be it the McNeills who started, in Muchy because they did start, some of the fair treatment and the integration. In terms of the Buxtons themselves, I think that they would have had to have been part of it because, this was nobody else was doing it. Meaning the railroad industry was notorious for not being fair, being racist. The coal mining industry was known for it. The railroad was not doing it. The Chicago Northwestern Railroad was not integrated in and of itself. So it wouldn't have come from them. They wouldn't have said, okay, now that we're owner, we're going to do this. So it has to be the men themselves. Many of the residents that were interviewed did say that the Buxtons themselves did not tolerate racial violence or intolerance. And so they would tell people that if you can't accept it here, you need to move on. So residents have said that. So I do think that a lot of that stemmed from probably them. In terms of why, well, if I look at the background for both of the McNeills and the Buxtons, both of them had fathers that were anti-slavery and that had served, or their sons had served in the Civil War on the Union side. So W.A. McNeill actually did serve in the Union, on the Union side. And then John Emery Buxton's brother did. So you're coming from that background. Maybe that influenced them. You also had, they were both, I think both were a part of the Congregationalist Church. I think, was it Dr. Sherrod had mentioned that The university itself, was very diverse at that time, and Ben Buxton did attend here for part of the time. So maybe some of these influenced them, I don't know. But I do feel, again, that it had to have come from them to a certain extent because they were the ones that were managing the town. And when the Chicago Northwestern Railroad purchased it, they wouldn't have decided that they wanted to do this, and they probably would have let the Buxtons do it as long as it was profitable. They're like, okay, if you're going to make money, if it's working, go ahead and do it. I don't think they would care one way or the other. So that's really just some of my thoughts about why, but again, it's just my opinion. Any other questions? Oh, sorry. Oh, you are. Yep. Oh, I think you might have to wait for the mic there. There we go. Thank you.
Are you familiar with a town in western Kansas that is founded by Afro-Americans? I don't recall the name of it. It's something like Simons or something like that. I'll have to research it.
I haven't
but
heard that one.
It was founded by Afro-Americans.
Right.
After the Civil War era.
No, if you think of that, let me know. I've not heard of that one.
I'm interested in the 8 churches that were there. Was one of them, by any chance, the Society of Friends?
Which one?
Society of Friends.
No, I shouldn't say no. I should say they said there were at least 8 churches there, but they did not say what some of the other denominations were. Besides, there was I think a Church in Christ, that church, the Baptist, the Methodist. But there was a Catholic church. The one actually was held in the Y on the 2nd floor because they didn't have a church building. But I did not hear that one that you just mentioned. Doesn't mean it, wasn't there. I just haven't run across it.
I know Cory Booker claims history from do you know any other famous people that trace their roots back to Buxton?
No. I don't know of any. No, sorry. I'm pleased that Cory Booker is mentioning Buxton and drawing attention to it. But yeah, he's the only one that I've heard of so far. Any other questions? Yes. Muchy, where was Muchakinock? I'm trying to picture where that is. I don't remember. It was south. I want to say it was southwest, but I'm not sure. It was about 8 miles. Do you know? On the way to Eddyville. Where you can see the sign, where it still has a sign, you mean, where it says Muchakinock Creek? No? Yeah. Yeah, I drove around. It's funny because Gordon Peterson had taken me. He kind of makes a pilgrimage for the last 80 years or so with his family. He kind of goes to the different areas, and he visits his family's cemetery. And so he had taken me on a drive through Consul, Bucknell, Haydock. Nothing's there at all. But to be honest, I don't even remember where it is. I can't picture it. I can't picture where Muchy is. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know exactly. Where did everybody go? People kind of went wherever they thought they could, get jobs. It's not like there was one central location for where everyone went. Some of the more prominent people, like, Dr. E. Ed Carter ended up going to Detroit and continuing to practice medicine. Hobe Armstrong stayed in the area and bought up more property. Archie Harris also bought property. He was one of the ones that was a miner there. He gotten into farming and bought property there. Other people went to Des Moines. They went to the bigger cities, Cedar Rapids. Herman Brooks, who I didn't mention, actually went to, he was another baseball player, one of the Wonders. He actually went to Chicago. So people pretty much scattered wherever they thought they could find jobs. There wasn't one central location that people went to. Yes? Oh no, you've got your notepad. This is scary.
What type of coal was mined in Buxton?
Bituminous. I probably said that wrong. Bituminous. Bituminous. Thank you. Bituminous coal.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so in the interview, they said like the KKK would like burn the cross up the street. Did they ever like try to intervene and like cause havoc within Buxton?
No, there really was nothing written of anybody causing havoc in Buxton. The only thing that comes close to that, and this was really more in Muchy, was, Muchy was not unionized, and the miners that worked there did not really have any interest in joining the union because they were getting good pay. So there would be miners that would come down from the north to try to get them to either strike on sympathy strikes or to join the union. And so there were instances there where they were coming down to agitate. And in those times, and this was when when John Emery Buxton was one of the superintendents as well, they would arm the men there and, tell them, if, since they're not striking, and we have work to do, they were giving them guns and stuff to fight them off. So the point is, and then also sometimes the militia would come in. The point is, the only time there was people coming in to cause problems that I've been able to find so far was really as it related to strikers coming down. And I think the reason for that also was because, again, this was a company town. This wasn't just a bunch of people deciding we're going to form a community here. This was a company, and if there was any problems, first of all, they were not going to let that happen in their town. They had the money or the wherewithal to get, either ammunition to call in, a militia to help. They had the resources to do that, and they also had a dedicated security guard or whatever that would go around and monitor, their property. So the point is, I think that was a big deterrent because it was a corporation that owned it, and it was not going to be allowed. Yes?
Is there any record of how many, thank you, is there any record of how many Buxton houses still exist and were moved to other locations?
Not to my knowledge. It seems like you just hear about it, piecemeal. Oh, this is a Buxton house. There's a few, I know in Ottumwa. I think I've heard of there's a few here in Oskaloosa. Of course, the Nelson Pioneer has the one on display there for people to look at. But I don't know of a record anywhere that says, okay, here are all the Buxton houses throughout Iowa. Mm-mm. It's just people mentioning it. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you know, were there interracial marriages back then?
Yeah, surprisingly there were. Hobe Armstrong, who I mentioned there, is about 1870 something. He actually married a German woman in Muchy. So again, that was 1873, I think it was. There was also one of the baseball players. What was his name? He married a white woman. Lottie Armstrong married a white guy. In fact, Carl Kitzman, the guy that you hear speaking or have heard speaking, he was married to one of Hobe Armstrong's daughters. So there were actually quite a few there. And people that were interviewed, again, they just mentioned it as if it was they were pretty matter-of-fact about it too, both white and black. It's like, oh yeah, we had some, so-and-so was. So again, that was pretty rare, but there definitely were some in Buxton. Yes?
I'd just be interested in, because I don't know how familiar you are with William Penn's story, but,
I'm not.
Equality was something that was embraced, long ago at the founding, with the Friends and how they saw things.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, for me, it's just really weird to think that there's this great diverse campus here, from back then, and it had a fire, and the community rallied to support and rebuild it,
mm-hmm.
which was a rare thing. I mean, all kinds of buildings burned down and never came back, colleges that closed and things. So it's just crazy to me to think that there's this place in this county and then this Buxton place in the same county, and I don't know anything about the overlap of those communities, but it seems very similar in a lot of ways. And to hear that racist comment about Oskaloosa was just like, well, that's weird. Why would it be like that? I mean, I suppose there's other people, but the whole community came behind and raised a bunch of money to rebuild Penn, and that was always a diverse place. So, so I guess that's just too bad.
Yeah.
But is there any kind of connections other than one of the guys went to college at Penn, you think? I mean,
Well, I don't know, and that's what I'm looking for, these connections. Like, I didn't even know I was excited when I found the connection between the McNeills and the Buxtons, because I hadn't seen that in a book before. And then when I found, McNeill recommended John Emery Buxton. So it's like, okay, well, there's a connection. They knew each other, and they seem to be kind of like-minded, thinkers in some ways. So again, you mentioning this, and then me finding out that, okay, Ben Buxton, who becomes, the superintendent who starts Buxton, he went, to Penn University, attended for at least 3 years or so. So it's like, okay, there's a connection. So it's like trying to then dig deeper to find out, okay, well, is there anything to these connections? Did that form, was there something that he learned here that, made him decide, that I want to take it further? I don't know. That's the search is now, trying to dig deeper and find out, if there is a connection. And also, I keep thinking there has to be some records, from the company, because I found some records that were like meeting minutes, board meeting minutes, between the railroad and the Consolidation Coal Company. But it's just really kind of about business, it's how much land was bought, which mine is open, and then when they were deciding to sell to Superior, it was memos about why, and here's the finances, what have you. So I keep thinking if those kinds of records exist somewhere in some historical society basement, there has to be, some documentation of correspondence going back and forth about other aspects of management in Buxton. So to your point, it's just trying to find these connections. I don't have that connection that you just mentioned. I haven't found it, but I keep looking,
It seems like there'd be possibly students from Penn that lived in Buxton. I mean, the opportunity was there.
Yeah, could be.
I can't imagine they wouldn't have learned about it.
Don't know. Could be. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. I appreciate it. Great questions.
And I just want to say that there's about another half hour for a book signing back here. So if this piqued your interest and you'd want to grab a copy of the book, Rachelle will be here for about half an hour. Thank you.